Continuing our reading in Abraham Hannibal and the Raiders of the Sands by Francis Summers Cox. Today is chapter 22, Shipwreck, dated April the year 1704. After 3 days they reached the island of Cyprus, where they stopped to fill up with fresh water and food, and then they carried on northwest. The slave children had their wrists untied, except when they were in a port, and Abraham was almost beginning to enjoy himself. Flying fish and other even stranger sea creatures leapt through the glittering blue water. Dolphins was their name, he learnt. Some days there was no wind to speak of, and the little ship just bobbed with the waves, while other days a cool breeze blew, but it was never so rough that he felt sick. The Turkish sailors were good-humored, and he even made friends. There was a little group of slave children, as black as he was, but taller and thinner and with strange scars on their foreheads, who had been brought in to Cairo slave market all the way down the Nile from deep in the land of the black people. Abraham and they couldn't understand each other, their languages, but the others had all learnt a fair bit of Arabic on the year's journey from their homeland, so they managed in that. The slave children scratched board games on the deck with charcoal and played with any bits and pieces they could find, or played Spot the Dolphin and Count the Flying Fish. And Abraham would forget that he had a master now, that he had lost everything that was precious to him. But at night, settling into the mat in the crammed and stinking hold, he would whisper, like a magic charm, the words that sometime, he would say to the king of the Franks. And then very early on the 19th day, as they passed the first of the Greek islands, the sky that had been a peaceful blue since they left Africa turned gray and wild. The sea began to pitch and heave, and the wind blew in violent gusts. The sailors hastily lowered the sails, but the steersman could do nothing with the ship, as she was driven on helplessly before the wind, rolling and plunging into the deep trough of one wave, tossed high on the crest of the next. Screaming prayers and promises to be better people, the free passengers scrambled below decks to join the slaves down in the hold. But Abraham had other ideas and began to struggle his way across the deck to the ship's side. His white cotton robe, heavy with water, wrapped itself tightly around his legs, and the driving spears of rain stung his cheeks and his eyes. He could hardly stand upright against the force of the wind that tried to push him back with every slithering step he took, and whipped his face raw. The deck, awash with rain and sea, pitched and tilted under Abraham's bare feet. One moment the ship's bow plunged down into the frothy gray sea, and as she was flung back again, water poured over her deck from the front. The next moment her bows were pointing skyward, and her stern was in the water. And then she was hurled bow down again, water pouring over her deck from the back. The din was horrific, the wind roaring, the rain hammering, every rope and plank and joint groaning, sailors yelling orders and curses, passengers and slaves screaming, and over again great rumbling rolls of thunder from the storm clouds above. At last Abraham reached the ship's side and clung on tightly to the clammy wood. All around was nothing but an emptiness of gray. Gray clouds, gray sea, merging one into the other, and the white of the huge waves breaking over the little ship. And yet Abraham was suddenly seized with a wild excitement. This storm is the most powerful thing I've ever known. Like the time I rode Father Stallion, but far faster, far stronger. There's no Master Ahmet now. No masters and no slaves. What can he do against this storm? Maybe we'll be driven onto the land somewhere and I'll escape. The Greek people are Christians like Yanni. Maybe they'll help me and I'll get to the land of the Franks after all. Oh, Lahia, help me. Be as brave as you were. Then the wind, the wild movement stopped. With a fearful crash and judder, one of the masts snapped with a huge cracking sound and toppled over with a great splintering of wood and ripping of ropes and canvases. For a moment there was a terrible stillness, and they knew that they had struck a rock. The passengers and the slaves struggled up onto the deck, and there was a wild rush and panic as the free passengers and the crew struggled in the stinging rain and roaring wind to get a place on the two little lifeboats. Then all at once some of the sailors started shouting, "Land ahoy! Land ahoy!" The slaves knew they had no chance of being allowed a place in the crowded little boats, and they clung to the ship in desperate despair. But Abraham called out, "Come on, land so near. The waves will carry you up there. Grab something that floats and jump." And he picked up a wooden hen coop that had survived the storm, emptied out the chickens, and jumped with it into the boiling gray sea. He felt the water close over his head as he sank down and down into the darkness. Then he found himself forced upward again until his head was up out of the water, and he was sneezing and breathing in air once more. Gripping his hen coop, he struck out with his spare arm and his feet toward land. Bobbing in the water around him, he could see a very few dark heads of slaves who had followed his example. But then the waves picked him up and hurled him away, plunged him down, and tossed him around and again, until, after a lifetime of battering and pitching, he at last felt himself scrape against the gravelly bottom and staggered up out of the water and collapsed onto solid, though not very dry, land. That's the end of chapter 22.